Hi, everyone. This is Sam Silverman, Managing Partner of EB-5AN. Thank you for taking time to join us on today's webinar. Today, we're going to chat about why is it critical for EB-5 investors to work with an experienced EB-5 immigration attorney, and we'll also talk about some recent EB-5 investor issues that clients investing $800,000 are facing with the EB-5 program. All right. A little bit about EB-5AN. We're a leading EB-5 investment fund manager. We've worked with thousands of families from more than 70 countries around the world. We have many regional centers that cover the entire continental United States. One of the things that makes us unique in the industry is we have 100% commitment to investment transparency. So we're very focused on providing potential foreign investors with all of the documentation, the I-956F project submission, along with all the financial statements for the project, so investors can have the full set of information available when making an investment. One of the things that also sets us apart is a very active online educational presence. So our YouTube channel has thousands of videos with helpful information, and our blog is very, very active with lots of posts about project diligence, how to identify red flags, and lists of questions to ask for both potential project developers and immigration attorneys as well. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Sam Silverman, one of the two managing partners at EB-5AN. A little more about my background and bio is there on the left-hand side, and my partner Mike there on the right side. As I mentioned as well, we operate a network of regional centers that covers the entire continental United States. And the reason we do that is it gives us access to be able to select the most compelling rural and urban TEA projects around the country without having to only focus on one or two particular geographic areas. Our reach is global. We've worked with investors from more than 70 countries around the world. And this is a map showing some of those countries. Many of our projects and educational materials have been featured in some of the leading publications around the world. Here's a brief list of some of those. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest panelist, Ahmed Khan, a well-experienced and established EB-5 immigration attorney who's now working for EB-5AN and helping to educate potential investors in how the EB-5 program works and how to evaluate potential investment options. So I'll let Ahmed jump in and introduce himself and share a little bit about kind of what the theme is for today's webinar and why it's such an important topic for investors to really get a hold of before they decide to do an EB-5 investment.
Yeah, Sam, thanks for having me on. And yeah, today we're going to be covering just something that's very near and dear to my heart, being an immigration attorney myself. Part of the process when you're an investor in the EB-5 process is selecting an attorney. And today we're going to be talking about why it's just so important to pick the right one and what they can be doing to make sure that your case goes smoothly and effectively until you get your green card through the EB-5 process. So you can see on the screen there, I've got a lot of experience as an attorney. I've worked at some of the top law firms in the country, helping investors file their applications. And I've also been a regional center executive now for over 5 years. So happy to be here today and share my experiences.
Perfect. Thank you, Ahmed. All right, so to start with, just at a very high level, why is it so important to work with an EB-5 immigration attorney?
Yeah, so, they don't call it the practice of law for nothing. And especially in a field like EB-5, that changes pretty often. I think that as professionals in the EB-5 space, we're constantly keeping track of what USCIS is doing in terms of policy changes, how the laws have changed. There's new case law that comes up, and we'll talk about some of that. But essentially, you need an advocate on your side, an EB-5 immigration attorney who understands all of these things and knows how to apply them to your situation and to your case. So you might be in the middle of your source of funds process, and a new case law comes out or a new case gets won against USCIS that kind of changes the interpretation of something that's applicable to your case, you want an attorney that's going to be able to apply that to your case immediately versus someone who doesn't even know that it happened. And then, even on a more micro level, a good attorney is really going to prevent what you might call careless mistakes on a lot of the EB-5 process. When you start getting into the forms, you start getting into the various different steps that it takes to file an EB-5 application. You'll note that there's a lot of different things. There's a lot of different forms that all correlate to one another. Each form has a lot of different sections that have to be filled out accurately. And so the first and foremost thing is just working with an experienced EB-5 immigration attorney is going to it's going to prevent errors, right? Really, from like I mentioned, from the source of funds perspective, and on a broader sense, as you're going over your case and kind of strategizing how to best pool your funds together and make the investment, but also as you're preparing the actual application itself, an attorney who's experienced, who has seen different ways that people can mess up. I think one of the most important things to understand is that attorneys are people too. They're humans too. And we've all made mistakes in our careers as attorneys. Seeing those mistakes over time and knowing to prevent them is what makes you a really good attorney. Okay. No one's perfect all the way through. And so working with an experienced attorney who's seen those errors in the past, has seen those mistakes happen, whether by themselves or by other attorneys, can really help to prevent them happening in the future. Um, Another thing that I think is super important when you're talking to a client as an attorney and they're giving you their take of how they would like for their case to go, right? They're saying, "Hey, I've got the funds in XYZ account. Here's how I'd like to collect them. Here's my timeline. Here's what I'd like to do." A good attorney will kind of have back and forth with them and say, "Look, this you may want to do it this way, but it's actually not going to work in the EB-5 context, or it may not be as good for you as maybe doing it a different way." And having an attorney who identifies that quickly and kind of nips it in the bud early on will allow you as a client to make better decisions moving forward. Essentially, now you know that there's something that's going on in your case that may not actually be best for you. You can then think, okay, well, what else should I be doing instead that might actually put me in a better position? So having someone with the experience to point out mistakes that are possibly coming up in the future or red flags that are coming with a particular source of funds in the future is really, really important, because it just gives you more time to prepare to strategize correctly. And then finally, I think, even if you are a very experienced attorney, like I said, we're all human. You are going to make mistakes. It does happen from time to time. And sometimes it's not even a mistake. Sometimes it's USCIS making a mistake or the government just kind of completely overlooking something. And in those scenarios, again, you want an attorney who's going to advocate zealously on your behalf. You're going to want an attorney who's going to basically not only know how to fix mistakes that have occurred or know how to deal with USCIS when they've made a mistake, but also will go after it and do it in a timely manner. I think a lot of the problem with EB-5 can be just longer processing times, longer kind of wait periods. That's only exacerbated by an attorney who isn't zealously advocating on your behalf and kind of pushing the government to give you the decision that you're looking for.
Yep, exactly. All right, let's spend a few minutes on just diving into some specific issues that we're seeing currently that EB-5 investors are facing in the market today.
Yep. Yeah, and I definitely want to emphasize that a lot of these problems that we see are either preventable or easily solved as long as you've got a good attorney on advocating on your behalf, right? The first one that I think, the first two really that I think, are very easily identifiable, and an experienced immigration attorney will always do something to kind of prevent, is USCIS just completely missing the ball on which category you're investing into, whether or not you're actually current based on the visa bulletin, and basically just rejecting your adjustment of status as a result, right? This is pretty easily solved. A lot of experienced firms, both big and boutique, usually include some kind of cover page that shows very clearly that the person that is filing in this category and they are current based on the current visa bulletin. and therefore are eligible to file an adjustment of status. This seems like such a small, minor thing, but it has really large implications, right? As we approach a backlog appearing on the visa bulletin, having an adjustment of status rejected, first of all, it takes weeks to know that it's even happened and then to correct it, right? You don't even know that you've been rejected, typically for about 2 to 3 weeks. And then you've got to go through the process of refiling, often with a new medical exam, and then basically waiting to make sure that that one got received correctly, right? So this is a timely error in the sense that it costs a lot of time to an investor, and it's very easily fixed by having a proactive attorney who's including that information right at the very beginning, so that whoever's in the mailroom and the officer that picks up the case doesn't improperly classify the filing and accepts the adjustment of status, so that the investor is now safe, essentially, from the sense of having an adjustment of status filed and received and accepted. Another pretty big one, and again, this seems pretty basic, and yet we see it often, is just not having the right documentation to show that an application even can be filed. So the visa bulletin has much more to do with the adjustment of status, but if you're an investor filing into an EB-5 project, one of the basic things for post RIA, if you're going into a regional center deal, is that you need to have a 956F at minimum proof of delivery, right? You want to have either proof of delivery, or then it goes up the ladder from there to either a receipt notice, or ultimately, if it's already been approved, the approval notice, right? And there's a lot of different ways that an attorney can mess this up by either not including any of these documents in the first place, leading to USCIS possibly rejecting it, or not even starting to adjudicate it. Second would be, knowing that it's not even knowing that it's happened yet, right? So a really inexperienced attorney not even knowing the questions to ask and saying, hey, you've chosen this project, I don't see a 956 F, at least proof of delivery, can we obtain that from the regional center? So just completely, forgetting to ask for that and filing the application without it would lead to a rejection, or worse, it might even be accepted, and then months later you find out that there was no 956F proof of delivery at the time of filing, right? And now the case is going to be rejected. So even though if later on down the road you've now got that 956F approval, if at the time of filing, there was nothing there to prove that the 956F had been received by USCIS, your case is ultimately going to be denied. So again, very, very minor thing that if you're an experienced attorney is one of the first things you look for. But if you're inexperienced, it could be one of those things that you just kind of forget to check, and could lead to a really, really big problem down the road.
Exactly. One thing I want to emphasize here is that these are again very small mistakes, but the outcomes are catastrophic, right? Not getting the EAD potentially ever, or years delay, or having to refile the whole application, perhaps not get the EAD again for years, but also have to spend $12,000 again and be delayed, several months with the filing for the green card. So, there's major negative immigration implications if these mistakes are made. And so that's why it's just super critical to make sure you're working with someone who knows what to check for and is doing this, day in, day out on a regular, current basis. Because the mistakes the government's making today, are much different than the mistakes that were being made, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So if an attorney, is only doing a handful of cases a year, it's likely that they won't, you don't want to be the guinea pig when the first time that error shows up on the attorney's desk and they're not, well versed in how to address it.
Exactly. And to your point, Sam, I think the catastrophic, downside to a lot of these is especially with the visa bulletin one, right? Like if for whatever reason USCIS just chooses to reject you, even if it's improperly. And let's say you've got something that's really important on the line. Let's say maybe you're running out of status and you need that adjustment of status to remain in the United States. Let's say that you've got a kid who's aging out and you need to get that application in before they turn 21. These are unfixable mistakes once you miss a deadline, right? Or it's a really uphill battle to get USCIS to basically nunc pro tunc it, which means basically go back in time and basically apply an earlier date to a filing because of a simple mistake. And so it's so important to have an attorney who understands, one, what's on the line for each client and kind of what hangs in the balance, but two, just be super careful. Like we said at the very beginning, EB-5 is constantly changing. There's not volatility, but this is a relatively newer area of immigration law, and it's constantly undergoing reform and change. And so having an attorney who's abreast of all those changes and is aware of all the different ways that USCIS can mess up and taking proactive steps to avoid that is going to be an attorney that gets you a better outcome.
Exactly. All right, let's talk about a few just kind of common issues that we're seeing today with clients filing applications.
Yeah, and some of these, are something that we've dealt with as attorneys for a long time. As I remember back when I first started, we used to, double, triple check every box for FedEx before it went out. We had senior attorneys constantly looking at signatures, constantly looking at addresses to make sure that everything was going to the right place with all the signatures that it needed and things like that. And still, even with all that, sometimes USCIS will then on the back end make a mistake and improperly reject the filing. Or maybe they'll accept it, but they won't give all the administrative things that they're supposed to, like things like receipt numbers aren't issued, or they just incorrectly reject an application. So there's a lot of ways that things can go wrong here, and this is going to kind of come back to what we were talking about with having an attorney that knows how to solve these issues, right? So we've seen everything from documents just not making it to USCIS, right? FedEx has mess ups, or UPS or USPS, whoever your attorney is using. We've had that happen before, and we've had it happen in very critical situations where an RFE was due, and so having an attorney that's dealt with that before, knows how to put together a very quick response and which avenues to go through, supervisor review at USCIS to make sure that that gets corrected immediately, right? It's no fault of the attorney or the applicants at that point, but having proof, essentially. Some attorneys don't even keep proof that they filed a case. They don't keep the FedEx receipt. That kind of stuff becomes really important when FedEx doesn't actually deliver the case like they're supposed to. Having an adjustment of status improperly denied. Again, we talked about the visa bulletin issues. Any number of reasons that USCIS can just completely mess up in the mailroom and improperly reject the case. Maybe two checks were stapled too close together and they didn't see the second check and rejected it because of that. Just all those things, having records of that. Good attorneys will have records of everything that they filed, and showing that proof to USCIS is really what makes a big difference. And getting some of these mistakes corrected. We see it very often that they fail to issue a receipt number, or as we're seeing on the right side here, that the receipt number just isn't being tracked online. Again, having an advocate on your behalf that basically knows that there's an online account that you can get registered into, and you can reach out to USCIS and ultimately get this corrected is really important, right? I hear a lot of attorneys just say like, oh, like that just happens, we're just going to let it be. Well, you could do that, or you could say that sometimes it's going to work if we reach out to USCIS to fix this, sometimes it won't, but we're at least going to try. And I've found that the attorneys that are constantly trying and advocating on their client's behalf are the ones that are seeing better results. And then I think finally the most annoying mistake is the incorrect request for evidence. And we've all seen those RFEs where you submit all the documentation and then you get a boilerplate response back asking for those very same documents. That happens all the time. That's not something that's new. It's not something that's unique to EB-5. USCIS doesn't always have its act together. And we've seen administrative mistakes like that happen across the board for years. And again, having an attorney that doesn't panic, throw caution to the wind, withdraw your case, that's really, really important. Having an attorney that has experience tell USCIS that they're incorrect, that they are asking for documents that have already been received by them is just really important. And when you're casting that response, you want that attorney to push back, and I think that's okay in a lot of instances with USCIS. And only an experienced attorney will feel comfortable doing that. An inexperienced attorney will likely, like I said, freak out, think about withdrawing, tell them, "Oh, I don't know what's going on," something along those lines. So it's really, really important to have an experienced attorney here.
And Ahmed, before we jump to the next slide, you know, we've talked about how important it is to find that experienced and on top of the ball immigration attorney. How do you, as an investor, how do you find that? Like, all right, now we know what we're looking for, but how do you kind of discern, who meets those criteria from the outside in? Like, you've been on both sides, so yeah, what are some of the tips you give to immigration or excuse me, to EB-5 investors who are, let's say in the process of interviewing, researching, and hiring a potential attorney? Like, what do you tell investors to kind of focus in on, to make sure they find someone who's going to be, capable and be able to address these potential issues?
Yeah, look, I mean, when you're talking to an attorney, you're really looking for two things. One, you're looking for someone who's going to put together a source of funds that's going to be approved by USCIS. And then two, just as importantly, you're looking for an immigration attorney who's going to guide you through the immigration processes and deal with USCIS. For both of these, knowledge is power. The more experience and practice that they've had doing both of these things, the better they're going to be. So understanding how long they've been practicing, how many cases they've done, where those cases have come from, right? If you are an Indian foreign national who's got funds coming from India, well, guess what? India has very specific RBI restrictions and currency export restrictions that only an attorney who has dealt with Indian source of funds would know. If you're a Chinese investor coming from mainland China and you've got to move funds across borders, you know the challenges that come with that. You want an attorney who has done that before and can guide you accordingly. So it's extremely important to have uh, kind of a little bit of due diligence questions ready when you're speaking with an attorney of, hey, just want to make sure that you've done this type of case before. What problems have you seen? I think proactively asking that question to an attorney will really help illuminate just how much that attorney knows about that topic, right? There's problems with every aspect of EB-5. So if an attorney just says, "Oh yeah, like we don't see many problems," that's usually just not true, right? There's a lot of issues that come up at every stage and with every source of funds. So an attorney who identifies those to you proactively before you even have the conversation about your specific situation can really show you that, okay, this attorney knows what they're talking about. They know what to look for, and I can kind of trust them. So I think those are my two big things. Really always look at the track record of the attorney, just like you're checking the track record of a developer on a project, or you're checking the track record of a regional center that you're investing with. You also need to check the track record of the attorney that you're working with to understand just how much experience they have, what they've done, what their success rate, have they had any failures? If so, what were the reasons? And then the second thing is definitely just asking them proactively, like, hey, this is, generally what my source of funds is going to be. What issues have you seen in the past that come with these kinds of sources? And then hearing their answer and kind of making a decision based off of that.
All right, perfect. All right, let's talk about a couple more just recent issues that we've seen for current investors filing.
Yeah, so as we get closer and closer to a backlog, I think a tendency is to rush things or freak out when you see something that isn't exactly the way it should be in this process. And any immigration attorney will tell you that USCIS drives all of us crazy. It doesn't always happen the way you want it to, but having that experience of knowing that things can go wrong and still end up ultimately okay is really important. Account tracking and notice issues has probably been the number one issue that we've seen over the last year or so with EB-5. This is not necessarily a problem, but just leads to anxiety. And again, having an attorney that can just basically tell you that and then just remind you that, hey, look, the only thing we can really do here is continue to log into our USCIS account, reach out to USCIS, somewhat frequently, and try to get this resolved is the only thing that you can do. So working with an attorney that's familiar with that, understanding that it's not necessarily a problem, but something that they can be proactive about is key. And then the second thing here is, we've seen a lot of investors start to push their attorneys sometimes, and there's definitely a reasonable amount of time that it could take to do an EB-5 case. And I think finding that balance can be very tough. Um, One of the things that I think people really put attorneys into a bad situation sometimes, and this is maybe not on the attorneys themselves, but sometimes on the clients, is not gathering the documents early enough, right? We're approaching a deadline. Let's say a visa bulletin retrogression hits on the 14th of a month. Well, you've only got to the end of the month to file, and you realize that you haven't given your attorney any documents, and now they have to review, along with all the other clients that are, I'm sure, rushing to do the exact same. So really just getting that done ahead of time as quickly as possible is a huge step in this process to avoid backlogs and retrogressions and kind of untimely filings or careless mistakes in those filings as you rush through to get something filed. And I think some of this onus falls back on the attorney as well. It's their job to send that document list of things that they need to the client early enough. The client can start gathering all everything and have it over to them for review. So it's definitely a two-way street, but a source of funds in a lot of ways can be the only variable in a case. And like our projects are all 956F approved, so the only immigration risk really is something from the client side. The sooner you get to work on that, the more time you give the attorney, and the attorney just being very uh, transparent in their review process and saying, okay, I've looked at this document. Here's what I still need. Not just holding on to documents for days or weeks at a time without any kind of feedback. That's all going to be really important to make sure everything gets timely filed.
Perfect, perfect. All right, so the last two, let's just spend like a minute or two on each of these.
Yeah, and then, for number 7 here, these are just common mistakes within USCIS and immigration law in general. It's not particular to EB-5, right? There's form revisions that come out all the time, and not only are there form revisions, sometimes USCIS is just changing one word of one question on a form. And so just having an attorney that is not only experienced but knows that USCIS can pull these antics from time to time is really key, because yeah, just one word can change the wording of an entire question, change it from a positive answer to a negative answer. And so you want to have an attorney who's careful enough to make sure that that's the case. They're using the most recent versions of the form. They're not filing an older version that could get rejected. And that they're putting the applications together in a clear and concise manner. I've seen applications where attorneys just submitted all the supporting documentation with no attorney cover letter or narrative explaining the source of funds. And realistically, that doesn't give the officers a roadmap to understand the source of funds and ultimately adjudicate that application, leading to either delays, a tough RFE, or even a denial if they can't see everything that they want to see right up front. So you want to find an attorney that's going to make the job easy for USCIS, not put them on a treasure hunt. If you do notice, and again, everyone makes mistakes, it does happen. You do notice that you've missed a document or something was omitted from the application that you meant to submit, or even if you have an interfiling, right? Let's say you've done a partial investment and you now need to update the file. Having an attorney who's done that before, knows the mechanism for doing an interfiling and making sure that those documents are properly received so you don't get a tough RFE, it's incredibly valuable. It's incredibly valuable in something that you definitely want to make sure that your attorney has done before if you're going to be pursuing that path. And then, yeah, I think the final thing is just keeping track of every letter and communication from USCIS. We get a lot of them, right? And everything from RFEs to notice of intent to deny. Sometimes none of those things. Sometimes the USCIS will sometimes just call or email a very quick document that they need to the attorney, and having an attorney that responds very quickly and is able to kind of get everything that the government needs in an efficient manner. It's a recipe for success for your EB-5 case. And then we talked a little bit about changes that are constantly happening in EB-5. Probably the most recent of this case law portion would be the Button any case. versus Mayorkas, which basically clarified the path of funds for EB-5 investors. A lot of attorneys will still use this as a guideline more so than a rule, but it does help advocate for some source and path of funds that previously might have flown under the radar and not been okay. And now a lot of attorneys would say, okay, this actually looks very similar to what we saw in Butneni. Let's go ahead and include that case law in the filing just to give you that extra layer of comfort. So I think this is probably the biggest thing, is having an experienced attorney who is abreast of current issues, current case law, current decisions, and knows not only that that's happened, but also how to apply it to your case. And that only comes with experience, that only comes with practice, and that only comes with a willingness to stay kind of updated on all current issues and knowing what's going on in the industry and in the courts overall.
All right, so let's shift topics and spend a minute or two on some recent EB-5 visa demand trends. So we've seen kind of a rise in rural applications over the last 12 months. But Ahmed, just what does that kind of big picture view look like in terms of available visas for both rural and urban TEAs? And how are we advising clients who are considering making a filing today, if they're in the US versus out of the US? And then we'll quickly talk about the visa bulletin as well.
Yeah, so I think at this point, you've probably seen or heard the news that we're approaching a backlog on the visa bulletin, and the reason for that is, when the Reform and Integrity Act was passed in 2022, it essentially hit a reset on two new categories. No one was grandfathered into these categories, and so anyone who was filing in these two categories was basically starting at zero, and that was the urban high unemployment TEA and the rural TEA. There was also a third infrastructure projects. Difficult to put those together, and there's been very few of those overall. So we're just going to keep our conversation to these main two. And what we saw was a very large number of filings from the get-go in the urban high unemployment area projects. And then as that started to kind of show signs of, okay, a future backlog, people shifted their approach and started filing more into rural TEAs. And so what you're seeing here is kind of representation of total filings. This data is a little bit more outdated. We have seen new numbers since that kind of just extrapolate further, but the idea here is the same. There's a lot more people who are waiting for green cards than there are green cards available in any 1 year. The question really now has become, just how long is that backlog going to be, right? What do we think it's going to look like, and just how long is it going to take for us to get out of it? And kind of understanding that there's only about 1,000 visas available per year in the urban high unemployment TEA, and then 2,000 available in the rural TEA. My advice to investors at this point is, look, just be ready for a backlog in both of these categories. Rural could be, anywhere from 2 to 3 years if you're from India or China to get your conditional green card. It could be shorter, it could be slightly longer, but I think that's a good timeline to keep in mind as you're applying. And then for urban, it's significantly longer if you're from India or China. And the question I get a lot is, why India and China? Well, you have to understand the way that the trickle down system works, right? India and China are both basically protected with 7%. And so they'll get their 700, 770 or so visas every year. And then after the rest of the world takes their visas, it's basically given on a first come, first served, and the set aside visas, right? So you get some extra protection from the set asides. But if there's rest of world filings that are taking up numbers in both the unreserved and in the set asides, that just takes away from visas that are available to Indian and Chinese investors. And since it's done on a first come, first served basis, and you are going to hit your yearly limit as an Indian and Chinese filer, you're always going to the end of the line, right? You're behind the people who are protected by the 7% who have filed ahead of you, and you're also behind all the rest of the world people who have filed ahead of you. And so you're just ultimately kind of at the back of the line. And so, yeah, I think that high unemployment number could be 6 to 7 years. There's going to be a lot of big events coming up in the next few years. India is going to catch up in the unreserved category. We're already up to 2022, which is almost RIA. And that should release a few hundred visas back into, kind of the fold, which would help. And then also maybe in the next 6 to 7 years, we're seeing China, hopefully static number in the unreserved category. And Department of State has done a great job of kind of issuing those visas and kind of starting to get through that backlog. Well, if they clear that backlog, that would, open up thousands of visas for everybody. So a lot of variables here, but I think the long-term kind of outlook stays the same. There's definitely a backlog coming, likely in both categories. It seems like rural won't be nearly as long as urban. There just hasn't been enough filings, and there's more room in that category. But this is always kind of a changing situation, and it kind of goes back to what we're talking about with having an attorney that understands how to do this math. First of all, I know attorneys that just don't even pay attention to this and just say, "Oh no, everything's fine, just file and we'll figure it out." That's not true, right? You want to make sure that you're setting expectations correctly for any client, and then yeah, just understanding that there are deadlines that come with this. A backlog does like an impending backlog doesn't change your long-term outlook. If you're filing now versus 2 months from now, it's not going to change when you receive your conditional green card. However, it can change when you can file your adjustment of status. So having an attorney that is cognizant of that, aware of that, and really putting together your application as quickly as possible to make sure that you don't lose out on that opportunity to get your EAD and advanced parole and lock in your child's age and ultimately keep your family in status inside the U.S. Even if you fall out of your current status is super super important. So yeah, there's a lot to be extrapolated from this. We're not going to spend too much time. We've got a lot of materials on our website about just exactly what we think is going to come. But what it really just means is we've gotten the warning in the January bulletin that it's coming. It's coming this fiscal year, most likely. We don't know when. We saw it get removed in the February bulletin, but it could happen that in the March bulletin, USCIS gives a warning, and then in the April bulletin it appears. So yeah, it seems like based on what we're seeing, the number of filings are continuously going up. I know we've seen a huge surge in demand since the election. As more and more people file, more and more people get approved, the visa bulletin is likely going to have a final action date specifically for India and China because of the countries that have used up all their visas in the unreserved category and are the dominant filers in the set aside categories as well.
All right, perfect. All right, so to conclude, I guess, Ahmed, just let's share up just a minute or two kind of about how you work with potential investors, looking for an immigration attorney to help them through the process and also, help them evaluate potential rural or urban projects, based on their, immigration goals and financial goals, and ultimately, what's most important, getting capital back faster, with a higher return, or getting the green card faster, and getting that in hand, before, there's a greater risk of an impending, future backlog.
Yeah, so I think when an investor comes and reaches out to us, the first thing that I usually do after having a conversation with them is say, "Hey, I think one of the most important things that you can do is speak to a good immigration attorney. Let me introduce you to 3 or 4 that you can speak to, interview, get some perspective on their thoughts as well, and just gain a little bit better understanding by hearing from different sources what's best for you." So yeah, I always kind of promote speaking to an immigration attorney very early on in the process. We work with everyone in the industry that has a lot of experience. We've worked with hundreds of different immigration attorneys over the years to file at this point thousands of EB-5 applications. So we are open to working with anyone who has experience. And yeah, I think when a client goes to an attorney, gets that sense of comfort knowing that they've got a lot of experience, and ultimately what you're hiring when you're hiring an attorney is an advocate on your behalf. You're hiring someone to look after you and make sure that you're making the right decisions and you're looking for someone who's going to go to battle for you with USCIS if it comes down to it. And so, when you're speaking with the attorneys, making sure that you're doing that due diligence on the front end, understanding their experience, understanding how much practice they've had, and understanding just, how many issues they've seen and how many issues they've solved over the years is super, super key. I think the best attorneys are not just ones that take on clients, but are also the ones that are taking on clients who are maybe unhappy with other attorneys and then fixing their case. And so asking your potential attorney partner if they've done that is another way to kind of determine if there's someone that you'd want to work with. So yeah, I think it's super important. Being an attorney myself, obviously, I know the nuance that comes into these rules. I think a lot of EB-5 sometimes can be just buzzwords and kind of just saying things that you've seen on a blog or something like that. But the reality is, it's so much more nuanced than that. And often there's no right answer. There's a discretionary kind of decision that needs to be made by both the attorney and the client to move forward. And the only way that you can do that correctly is if you have a really experienced practitioner who knows the ins and outs of the law, of how USCIS is going to take something, how they're going to respond, and then can advise you properly on what's best to do.
Yep, exactly. Thank you, Ahmed. And for any investors, interested in getting some introductions made, to experienced attorneys or, to speak about potential rural or urban projects, please reach out to Ahmed. His contact details are there, or, you can also just schedule a call with our team at a convenient time, and we're happy to get you all the details, financial statements, project documents, offering materials, whatever would be, most helpful as you explore EB-5, as a potential option to come to the U.S. long term. So thank you, Ahmed, and yeah, we'll wrap it up there.
Thanks, everyone.